Record.
Yeah, on your screen.
Got it. Come on, this is my moment. Okay, so my project while I was here in El Terreno was looking into adolescent pregnancy, which is pregnancy in female adolescents between the ages of 10 and 17 are usually the numbers that you hear. And then something just made a noise. And then the rate in Latin America is more elevated than other places around the world, but we've especially seen that in more rural and indigenous areas, it's even more so. So I have kind of compiled some statistics that I've found during my research. The one thing to kind of keep in mind with all of these statistics is that they're not all that accurate. They're likely kind of underestimates just because of, well, two reasons, mostly. The first being a lot of adolescent pregnancies, as well as instances of sexual violence or sexual assault go unreported, or pregnancies are kept secret. So those obviously do not reach these statistics that have been gathered. And then there's also kind of a really strong feeling of medical mistrust, especially in indigenous communities. So that kind of prevents their participation in public health surveys and other censuses. So it's pretty safe to assume that most of the numbers you see will be lowballs, which is upsetting because they already seem so high. So a couple that I kind of chose to highlight here are obviously the problem of gender violence, sexual violence. We see some incredibly high numbers. 32% of girls report experiencing some form of sexual violence while at school. And then overall, 60% of women in the country of Ecuador have reported some kind of gender violence. In terms of adolescent pregnancy, the main cause continues to be sexual abuse and violence, which is 42.7%. And then in more than half of those, it's usually sexual violence or abuse within the family circle. And then this one I always think is just kind of really quite shocking, is that within a decade between the years of 1990 and or I guess 2 decades and 2009, pregnancy in young women under 15 years have increased 78%. So obviously something is changing and not in a positive way. And so that's kind of what caused me to address this problem and look at it while I was here. So actually where we are, there's the estimated rate of teen pregnancy. The number that I've seen is 26 or 27%, but after speaking with everyone, including doctors at the health center, as well as just kind of women or other members of the community, everyone has estimated it to be a lot higher, so a lot closer to 50%. So I've just kind of, for the sake of this presentation, called it 35 to 45. Not sure, again, exactly where it lies. It'd be really hard to probably find that number. But just in my experience, I did a lot of work doing community visits to give the flu vaccine, as well as COVID boosters and COVID vaccines. And you see a large number of young women who are not in school because they are raising children. And so I would say that everything that I've seen in terms of my own experience have supported that this number is much higher. I also did some research on some of the laws here in Ecuador to protect these young women and to prevent pregnancy. So the first thing that I looked into was the age of consent in Ecuador, which is 14 years old. So any type of sexual act with a child under the age of 14 years old is statutory rape. There's also a kind of subclause where between the ages of 14 and 17, if it's deemed by a court that you gave consent under after some sort of deceit, then you can be prosecuted. So there's a little bit of extra protection going up until 17 years old, but for the most part, 14 is kind of the age at which the country has deemed that young women are mature enough and informed enough to decide that they're ready to have sex, which is kind of a pretty young age. And then more recently, abortion has been decriminalized here in Ecuador. In the case of rape or sexual assault, it's legal, but only in the case of rape or sexual assault. The time frame is also pretty short. So for the average adult woman here in Ecuador, you have until 12 weeks gestation, which is pretty early. And then for women under the age of 18, as well as women who live in more rural or indigenous communities, so it's harder for them to access healthcare and testing for pregnancy, they have until 18 weeks gestation. I gave this same presentation yesterday, and one of the things that we kind of talked about was how there's sort of loopholes in all of these laws that they're passing, kind of under the guise that they're making all these steps forward and making progress, but in reality, it's a lot of the times hard to prove for a young woman that she was raped and therefore is eligible to get a legal and safe abortion, especially if you wait for 18 weeks or 17 weeks. There's usually no physical proof of assault anymore. So how that actually works in practice, I don't know, but I have a feeling that it's not designed to give the mother the benefit of the doubt. And then the same thing with the clause of being 14 to 17. Oh, here. Sorry. Yeah, so the same thing with the kind of subclause of you can be prosecuted for having sex with a child between the ages of 14 and 17 if you used some form of deceit to gain hola Karina to gain consent. But again, in a court system, in a legal system, I don't know how this plays out in practice, but it would be my guess that it again does not often fall in favor of the women. I thought it was still important to just mention that this legislation does exist. Whether or not it's usable or successful, I don't know, but it does exist. And then what else? The other thing that I did a little bit of research on, and all these photos are just from the time I've spent here trying to grab pictures of the young children that I've seen who are being raised by single young mothers or their grandmothers, or sometimes even 3 generations of women, just to kind of give a sense of how prevalent it is here. The other problem that I think was important to address is there's a really high mortality rate here for a high maternal mortality rate here. So for the mothers, before, during, and after childbirth, a lot of medical problems arise that become more severe because the pregnancy was kept a secret, or they have not sought medical attention because of mistrust in the healthcare system. So some of the common problems there are gestational hypertension, which is just high blood pressure as a cause of your pregnancy, as well as just abnormal bleeding. Again, most of these problems, if kind of noticed and addressed early in the pregnancy, typically don't become life-threatening or severe. But because so many pregnancies are kept secret until so late, they can become more severe. So that's kind of another big problem that we're facing. And then in terms of the reasons why these pregnancies are kept a secret, or that these mothers aren't accessing resources to make sure that they have kind of a healthy pregnancy and are getting all the vitamins and tests and checkups that they need, especially in younger women, there's a huge sense of shame associated with this, pressure from your culture, from your family, from your religion, fear of becoming the topic of community gossip. And then in addition, again, this feeling of mistrust towards medical professionals, the cost of transportation to and from health centers. The health center here that I worked at for a week or so serves over, I think, 17 communities, Indigenous and rural communities, and some of them are over an hour away. And there's a lot of these families and who live in kind of the further out communities don't have cars. So if anything is going wrong during a pregnancy, it's often there's not much to do. So that's kind of another factor that's impeding mothers from getting proper care and unfortunately leading to a higher maternal mortality rate. So just brief overview, the three problems that I really, or the three takeaways that I had after doing my initial research was that there's an elevated rate of adolescent pregnancy here, without a doubt, and that it disproportionately affects the Indigenous populations. And then a large majority of those adolescent pregnancies are the result of sexual abuse or violence. So those were that's like the three-pronged big takeaway that I just wanted to try to start addressing. So what I actually did while I was here was I went to El Colegio here. So that's the students were about ages 10 to 15-ish. There were some a little bit younger, but we really only spoke to students ages 11 or 12 to 15. So that's grades like 6, 7, and 8. And I led sex education, reproductive health, and pregnancy prevention workshops, basically. So coming into it, I had one conversation with the director of the school who assured me that the students had basic lessons on male and female anatomy and would have some familiarity with terms such as condoms, birth control, and STIs and STDs. When I got there, we quickly learned that that was not an accurate assessment of their knowledge base. They really, pretty much we had to start at ground zero, so that was a bit of a learning curve. The workshops we kept them around 10 students. The most I think we had in any one workshop was 12 students. Again, ages 12 to 15. And the workshops lasted about 1 hour. And now I have a couple slides of just kind of the types of activities we did. So after our first couple workshops, we realized that we really needed to backtrack and cover some more of the basics before jumping into these kind of more complex terms and topics, specifically talking about like contraceptives. I jumped in trying to talk about stuff like that at the beginning. Come to find out they didn't really even understand anatomy, the event of fertilization, how it happens, or just how sex works. So backtracking, we incorporated an anatomy activity. These were the terms that were included, and I basically created 3 categories on the board: men, women, and both, and gave each student a little note card with the name of the body part on one side and the definition on the back, and then they were tasked with placing the note card in the correct category. This activity was actually incredibly interesting because I noticed that there was a higher rate of accuracy for the male anatomy compared to the female anatomy, even though I was speaking to a group of 10 young women. And for example, they were kind of commonly mistaking terms like vulva, clitoris, and ovaries and didn't really know where to put them. Whereas terms like penis, semen, testicles, scrotum, they had no accuracy issues with. And so to me, it became clear that there's definitely a gap in knowledge about their own bodies, especially in body parts that are associated with sexual female pleasure. So moving forward, if someone were to come in and continue work like this, I would encourage a real deep dive into male and female anatomy, and then especially for women, talking about in greater detail, not just what's absolutely necessary to reproduce, but the other parts that are involved with female pleasure and just things that they've truly never heard of about their own body. So the other activities we had, this one was what I came in with, and it ended up being a bit too advanced. So this game was myth or truth. So I made little signs that I handed out to all the students, and then I would read a statement about sex, relationships, or reproductive health, and they had to indicate by raising their sign whether they thought it was true or false. Again, this was what I came in with. I didn't know how kind of how basic their understanding was, or kind of lacking it was. So this kind of ended up not being very successful. I found that also a lot of the students were looking to their neighbor, looking to their friends, and all just going with the same answer because no one wanted to be the outlier. So because of that, I didn't really find this to be very helpful. Although, again, it did expose a lot of gaps in knowledge. For example, the first one is that pregnancy occurs as soon as male sperm enters the vagina. Pretty much everyone thought that that was true. They didn't really understand kind of the more complex processes that are occurring in order for pregnancy to happen. So that was interesting. Also, the fourth one, you can't get pregnant the first time that you have sex. A lot of people thought that that was true. So we were able to debunk a couple things for them. But again, yeah, I think this might be well suited for maybe some older students who have received a good base of a sex education curriculum. But for our purposes, this activity, we kind of scrapped it pretty early on. And then the last activity we did, we only had the opportunity to do this once, but I think in maybe a different context, it could be really helpful. So this one was asking students whether they agree or disagree with a list of statements. So I assigned one side of the room to be, I agree, another side of the room, I disagree, and then standing in the middle of the room would indicate that you're not sure, or it depends on the situation. So then I would read these statements aloud and ask the students to move to either side of the room to demonstrate what they thought about it. This actually was, again, we only had the opportunity to do it once, but I think if we kind of put this, maybe not even in a school workshop, more in a female empowerment workshop with some icebreakers and trust activities built in before as well, it would definitely be beneficial. A couple takeaways that we did get, the participants all reported that the only people they feel comfortable or would feel comfortable talking about sex with is their peers and their friends. No one reported having ever spoken to parents, teachers, or adults, which was kind of to be expected. The other one that I was interested in was whether they got, whether TV, movies, internet, social media was a source of information for them about these topics. And they all reported that it was not. So the only information they reported having received was through school, which we had established was pretty much nothing, or what they hear from friends or peers, which is the rumor mill pretty much. And then the last thing was one that I found interesting was whether or not the use of contraceptives went against their beliefs. And the vast majority of the students we spoke with indicated that they didn't go against their beliefs, or they didn't kind of see anything inherently wrong with the use of contraceptives, which to me showed that this age group might actually be a really good place to start, because the lack of communication from their parents, while it's extremely problematic in a lot of ways, it also means that the parents haven't had a chance to impart any really strict beliefs about these types of things. So moving forward, again, with future workshops, I think that starting at ages 11 or 12, which is 6th grade, is a good place to start. And then the last activity that we briefly attempted was doing kind of an anonymous questions opportunity where they could write questions on these pieces of paper that I handed out, and then I would collect them, mix them up so I didn't know who wrote what, and then answer them aloud. They ended up all being questions about me and my life in the United States and asking me to speak in English, which was sweet, but we kind of came to the decision that this probably wasn't the most helpful. So what we ended up doing was still giving them the note cards, and Karina and I provided them with our phone numbers, which we put up on the board, and encouraged them to send us any questions that they had after leaving, or if they needed someone to accompany them to the health center to ask any further questions, we'd be happy to do that. I don't know about Karina, but I have not received any messages, and I don't think that's entirely surprising. They've just very, very, very shy and kind of resistant to these topics. So I was not surprised that they didn't use that, but who knows, maybe one day they will. So then, unfortunately, I'm only here for a month, and in order to address these problems, I think there needs to be like a multifaceted, super comprehensive sex ed curriculum that's not just in school. It needs to involve the parents, it needs to involve other members of the community, and it needs to go into the family spaces. So I created a list of next steps that I've organized, I think, in terms of priority and then also feasibility. So the first one would be at the school. So I've kind of designed a curriculum and a topic breakdown that I think would be important and would address all, hopefully, of the gaps in knowledge that they have. I think it's important to dedicate more time than we had. We were only able to meet with each group of students once for 1 hour. Ideally, whoever's leading these courses would dedicate 1 to 2 weeks to each grade level. So the same students every day for an hour or two for 2 weeks. And so these were the topics that I outlined. The first being puberty and adolescent development. I think this would be especially important for the 6th graders who are kind of right in the thick of that, especially in terms of use of feminine hygiene products. When Karina and I were giving our workshops, there was definitely a gap in knowledge there. Their mothers, it didn't seem really they haven't given them a lot of information on how to use feminine hygiene products. So that would definitely be a priority. And then for this lesson, for this unit, I would want to keep boys and girls separate, just because I think that this topic can bring up a lot of embarrassment and shame, and it's important information to get across. And if that's done better, separating boys and girls, then that's the way it should be done. The rest of the lessons, however, I do think could be done combining both boys and girls. So the second one is healthy relationships and personal safety. This, I'm thinking, understanding boundaries, establishing boundaries, teaching how to say no to unwanted touching. And I think that it's important that this expands not just to romantic relationships, but also to adults in your family, as well as friends. So kind of just the basics there, not quite diving into romantic relationships or consent yet, more of like, these are my private areas. No one's allowed to touch them. These are the boundaries that I'm allowed to set for myself and that I should set for myself. And then resources as well, providing them if they ever feel unsafe or want to talk to someone. Then the next unit would be diving more into the romantic relationship. So that's decision-making, delay tactics for kind of delaying when you start having sex, abstinence, and consent. Consent probably being one of the biggest ones here. And in that, I probably would also want to include some information about the age of consent here, which we talked about before, and what that means for them and the laws that are there to protect them. So then the next unit would be anatomy and physiology, how things work. Again, we kind of established that this is a huge kind of gap that we need to address, so that I could see this taking 2 classes to do anatomy and physiology. Then pregnancy and reproduction, again, may take 2 classes. So this would include, I'm envisioning both the more scientific fertilization event between a sperm and an egg, as well as just the more practical logistics of what sex looks like and what it means. And then finally, contraceptives information with a focus on the contraceptive types that they offer at the health center. So that would be condoms, oral contraceptives, the injection, the implant, and then discussing the calendar method and how to kind of naturally track your menstrual cycle and use that as means of pregnancy prevention. And then the last 2 units, sexually transmitted diseases and infections. I think here would be a good moment to do a condom demonstration, which I intentionally think pushing towards the end would be best to kind of give the students some time to warm up and get used to the topics a little bit more, because I know that can be kind of jarring having a physical example like that. And then again, explaining resources that they have at the health center, the importance of STI testing, and maybe kind of what the consequences can be for leaving an STI untreated. And then the last unit I would envision would be kind of the more abstract things that come with this. So self-esteem, body image, identity, and gender expression. I think in the future, I would really like to have this lesson include a little bit more about gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, because the only exposure that I believe they have is towards heterosexual relationships and just binary male and female. So I think it would be really important to eventually dive into that. I would be hesitant to start with it just because there is such a reluctance and a resistance. So my hope would be for the future, this would be something that they could definitely incorporate, but also acknowledging how culturally lagged it is compared to other parts of the world. So kind of taking it slowly for the benefit of the students so that they don't feel overwhelmed. Then at El Terreno, this is, I think, arguably probably the most important part, once they're given all the information, is I would like to set up weekly female empowerment workshops for the young women in the community. So they would be open to women ages 12 to 18 probably. And it would be led by our female volunteers at El Terreno. And I had a pretty long list of ideas for what they could look like, these workshops. So just a couple. I've read a few research papers and case studies where using skits and theater performances has been really successful as means of teaching about reproductive health and sex education. So maybe incorporating something like that with some fun skits, improv activities, things like that. Then another workshop could be maybe practicing consent, saying no, in a self-defense class maybe. Also, I think a workshop on gender norms could be interesting, where you could do something called a memory journey, where you think about and reflect on what it was like to grow up as a girl, when you started to notice that there were maybe differences between your treatment as a girl, and then what feelings that brings up. And then another one would be workshops on women who have inspired you. I think it would be really a great opportunity for the volunteers to maybe prepare presentations on successful Hispanic women in history, or just women in their own life that they admire. And then also, I think this would be a great opportunity to reach out to members of the community and encourage them, if they want to come in, women in the community who have a story to share or have maybe a fun activity. So for example, I had the idea of maybe, so there are some artisans who kind of own their own business. I know there's a few in Semiatuk who we have some connections with. So maybe inviting someone like that in to talk about what it means to run a business, and just kind of the other options that exist in terms of career outside of just becoming a mother and working in the home. So that would be what I would hope for at El Terreno. And then the health center, I think it would also be good to have some involvement from the doctors there to kind of increase a little bit of exposure between the young people in the community here and the doctors to help combat the medical mistrust that we've seen a lot of. So maybe a monthly or every other month event where the volunteers at El Torino collaborate with the doctors to host events where it would be fun for the young people who decide to come. So it could be getting to know your doctors. They could answer questions about what their career has been like and what the path to get there was. There were a lot of girls in our workshops who expressed an interest in medicine and being a doctor when they grew up. So I think that there would definitely be interest in that. Or another idea I had was something like playing doctor for a day. The doctors could maybe bring out a stethoscope and a manual blood pressure reader and have them teach them how to use stuff like that to get them a little bit more involved, hands-on. And then kind of along with that, telling them more about the resources that are available at the health center that they might not know about, explaining more how contraceptives work, maybe even distributing condoms if that feels appropriate. And yeah, so just under the guise of it being this fun, connective event, which it would be, but then also being very informative, letting them know what exists there, so that maybe the hope would be that if they want to seek advice from these medical professionals, they feel that they can because they've established this baseline connection, friendship with them. And they also then wouldn't have to rely on their parents. They know the resources that are there and could do that on their own. And then, so the other last couple ideas that I had that would probably be a little bit more in the future would be parent training. I think this one is extremely important, but would probably be the most difficult to achieve. The older members of the community are kind of more stuck in the taboo of these issues. But if there was a way to gather parents, I don't know whether that would be through the schools or kind of just through community gatherings, but encouraging them to be more open in these conversations, explaining the statistics of how common it is for sexual abuse to occur within these family circles, and just kind of raise awareness about it and start the conversation to hopefully help to combat this stigma. Also to kind of let the parents know what our intention is. I think it's important to frame it as we are here to be informative. We are not here to push a way of life on your students, or sorry, not on your students, on your children. We are only providing this information so that they can make the most responsible and informed decisions. And framing it in that way to hopefully help the parents be more supportive and hopefully even helpful as a resource themselves. And then the last idea I had would be a mentorship program. So what I would envision for this would be women, mothers who had their children when they were very young, or who are currently young mothers, coming and speaking or meeting with young students and just explaining their journey, their takeaways, what they maybe wish they had done differently, what they wish they had known. So kind of just a real world example. Again, I think this would be maybe a little bit more difficult to achieve, but I think down the road, it could maybe even be one of the female empowerment workshops at El Torino. But that would be maybe a final idea, a final step to hopefully start eradicating this issue of teen pregnancy. So yeah, that was all of what I envision for the future and what I hope that someone will come and do and start after I leave. Again, I think it will take a very concerted effort over the span of months, and it will really involve all aspects of the community. But I do think that it would really show pretty immediate results, because I think what we've learned is that the biggest obstacle here is lack of knowledge, lack of education, lack of understanding of what's happening with your own body as a woman, and then the taboo and being too scared to talk to medical professionals, to your parents, to your friends about it. So I think that all of these steps together could really be hugely beneficial to starting to address these problems. So that's pretty much all I have. But if there are any questions or comments or concerns. Oh. So yeah, okay. So you mentioned the school at the beginning and how they were not very accurate regarding the teachings. Do you think they could help out or not? Do you see them as potentially an ally? I definitely do think that the school is open to pretty much anything. Their lack of, I think their lack of organization is just not from a place of not caring about their students. It's just kind of the way, unfortunately, the way that it is. There's only 12 teachers at the school, and there's, I think, about like 300 students or 400 students. So it's less about them not wanting these things and just maybe it not being practical. But from my interactions with the teachers, they are very, very open to intervention from volunteers. They welcome it because it kind of gives a little bit more structure. So I definitely think they would be very open to that. The other thing that I think having volunteers from El Terreno lead these workshops is a great short-term solution and definitely something. I came and did it for a week, so it could definitely be done easily. But I do think in order for it to be a more permanent solution and kind of more permanently in their curriculum, I think training the teachers as well, teaching them how to approach this curriculum, teaching them how best to start bringing up these topics so that if for whatever reason there's not a volunteer from El Terreno who can teach them, that they're still getting this information. So in that way, it becomes a little bit more permanent. Yeah, exactly. I was thinking that as well. I do think it's easier to have welcome volunteers to do it. And I think that they're definitely a good resource, but I think the ultimate goal should be training the teachers so that it can be a machine that works on its own without us. Ooh, if there was something I could change to have a bigger impact with respect to my experience, what would I have done? I think I wish I had known more what their knowledge base was walking into it and been able to prepare more from home so I could have come in and kind of hit the ground running, which is why I'm glad that I got the opportunity to outline these future steps. So hopefully the next person who comes doesn't feel like they spent their month just figuring out where they are. But again, that would have been very, very difficult. Even when I was here on the ground in person, I still didn't get accurate information of where the students were at. So hopefully this will be a good resource. It's gonna shut me out in like a minute. So we might have to either exit or
Yeah, I'd say thank you to everyone then.
yeah, my Zoom is gonna kick us out in a minute, but thank you for listening to me.